Another photograph has been leaked of the Prime Minister hanging out at a lockdown-breaking party. This time the gathering was in the Downing Street garden. It was in May 2020, so that's the first COVID-19 lockdown. In the picture, that's Boris Johnson with his wife and baby, along with a couple of advisors. One looks a bit like Dominic Cummings. We can't confirm that, so they're in the bottom right there. There is wine and a cheese board on the table behind Johnson's. There are the Johnsons and their advisors. There are another 4 people sharing a bottle of wine. And on the lawn, you can see 11 people, most of them mingling around a table topped with what look like half-empty bottles of wine. It all looks like a lovely occasion. And I'm reluctant to judge anyone for socializing outside, even in a pandemic. It's quite a safe thing to do. You can catch COVID if you sit for long enough next to someone who is outside. You know, Boris Johnson had just been seriously ill. They've been spending all day together anyway. So epidemiologically, that doesn't look particularly worrying to me. There is, though, a problem. That's because on May the 15th, when this gathering took place, none of the rest of us were permitted such niceties. Indeed, on that same day as that garden gathering, Health Secretary Matt Hancock told the country this.
People can now spend time outdoors and exercise as often as you like. And you can meet one other person from outside your household in an outdoor public place, but please keep 2 meters apart. This weekend, with the good weather and the new rules, I hope people can enjoy being outside. But please, stick with the rules, keep an eye on your family, and don't take risks.
I don't even know what keep an eye on your family means in that context, because if you go to a park, keep an eye on your family so they don't hang out with another family. In any case, what was not allowed at that point was for you to go out, like you had a massive garden, to go out to a nice green space and sit down with a group of friends. No, that was illegal. If you tried to do that, the police would probably come along and move you along. At this time, schools were also closed. Even playgrounds were bolted shut to stop children mixing. So this was, other people were not getting to enjoy the same freedoms that people in Downing Street were. Let's take a look at the emergency laws which were brought in March and which were in force in May, so when this gathering took place. They read, during the emergency period, no person may participate in a gathering in a public place of more than 2 people, except where all the persons in the gathering are members of the same household, where the gathering is essential for work purposes, to attend a funeral, or where reasonably necessary to facilitate a house move, provide care or assistance to a vulnerable person, provide emergency assistance, or to participate in legal proceedings or fulfill a legal obligation. So it was very, very difficult to go out and hang out in a group of more than one person. You'd need to fulfill one of these tasks, often quite unpleasant, involving funerals or, it wasn't a normal thing to do what they were doing. Now, the government, they'll be looking through the letter of the law. They'll say, aha, but that law you just read us, that was about a public place. And the Downing Street garden is not a public place. It's a private place. Now, the obvious riposte to that is that, forget the law. On a moral level, most of us don't have huge private gardens. So you were, having this pleasant time with all your workmates and your wife, and we weren't able to because we didn't have massive gardens. Beyond, though, that sort of moral political argument, there is still a legal question that needs clearing up because the law still potentially was broken in this situation. Now, Adam Wagner is a good source for this. He's a barrister, writes a lot about lockdown rules. And he said that while there were no specific laws, as I've said, about gatherings in private spaces, there were laws specifying the reasons you were allowed to leave your house. On that front, Wagner writes, the only reasonable excuse which would potentially apply here was the need to work or to provide voluntary or charitable services where it is not reasonably possible for that person to work or to provide those services from the place where they are living. He says, I doubt that being out of home for a primarily social gathering would fit into that. But the reality is that these people were at work. There's no way of knowing from a pic that they weren't working. And unlike later that year, gatherings weren't separately banned in this context. So in the second lockdown, it was banned to have any kind of social gathering with more than 2 people, even in a private space. Then the issue was more, why are you outside of your house? And he's saying that from that picture alone, you can't prove that they were outside of their house for an illegal reason. The government, of course, then have to claim this was a business meeting, which is what they did. Kay Burley grilled Dominic Raab on that question.
When was the last time you took your wife and baby to a business meeting?
Well, in fairness, I don't live in the place of work where I work. So number 10 Downing Street and the garden is used for work. It was used throughout that week. I think the PM is there seen just after the press conference he'd done, and people, folk at home will remember the daily press conferences, and he'd had meetings earlier, I think, with the health secretary earlier in the day or in the week. And you can see staff there. And look, so it's fundamentally a place of work. So this was not a question of whether...
You can't take your baby to work, especially when we're in the middle of a lockdown and a COVID pandemic, surely.
Well, but Kate, as you know, number 10 is also the residence of the Prime Minister. He's got a very young family, and I think if you begrudge his wife coming down in a break from the business of the day,
I don't think that's right.
She's
not just popped her head round the door, has she? She sat down with the baby, nursing the baby. There's wine on the table, there's cheese there, there's at least 14, 15 other people in the garden.
And that's because it's a place of work. They're all in suits, or predominantly in informal attire. Well, the picture I saw had people...
No, it's on the screen at the moment. Have a look.
Well, look, I think a large number of them... to be honest with you, look, the Prime Minister is in a suit.
So we've got used to these ridiculous excuses now. But that was Dominic Raab saying that even if there was wine and there was cheese and it all looked very pleasant, it was actually a business meeting because they were wearing suits. He was also suggesting Carrie had just come down because it was a break in the business meeting. That was, I think, probably the most politically embarrassing part of his answer to Kay Burley. Legally, he then went on to say something that was more incriminating.
This is a place of work, but it's also the residence of the Prime Minister. And sometimes, as in many work situations, particularly given the pressures that the number 10 team are under, they might have a drink after the formal business has ended. That is not anything to do with the social mixing rules, and it's consistent with the guidance at the time.
That particular clip wasn't quite as ridiculous as saying if you're wearing a suit, it can't possibly be social. But it's potentially more legally incriminating because he admitted the gathering took place after the formal business of the day, i.e., it wasn't a work meeting or even a work gathering. It was purely social. Adam Wagner, the lawyer whose tweets I showed you earlier, went on Sky to assess Raab's comments.
I wasn't completely convinced yesterday because it wasn't obvious when this meeting took place during the day, whether it was colleagues just popping out to, have some food and drink together during the working day, which I'm not sure at that time would have been unlawful. But having heard Dominic Raab say this morning on Sky News that this was a drink after the formal business had ended, so after a press conference, doesn't sound convincing as a work gathering. It sounds a lot like a social gathering. And at the time, the rules were slightly different earlier in 2020 than they were at the time of these alleged Christmas parties in December. You could have a gathering in a non-public space, but you still had to be there with a reasonable excuse for having left your home. And one of those reasonable excuses, the only one that could have applied, was likely to be the need to work, where that could not reasonably be done at home. And I don't really see how a social gathering, as Dominic Raab seems to have suggested it was, after work, so after the working day, would fall within that reasonable excuse.
So according to Adam Wagner, they probably did break the law. Now, as is probably quite clear to you now, the legal arguments here are all quite complicated, as the lockdown rules have all been quite complicated. The moral and political argument, much more clear. At that time, at that point in the lockdown, none of us were able to have wine and cheese sitting on grass with a bunch of our friends or colleagues. No, we were all stuck in our homes alone. I was relatively lucky because I was stuck at my home, doing these shows. There were lots of people who were actually having a hell of a time working in a hospital or missing meetings with loved ones who might have gone on to pass away from COVID-19. So it is very serious that they felt that they could take liberties in this particular way. Also, what we're seeing, as we have seen in so many of these rows about Downing Street parties, we're being taken for mugs. We're getting cabinet minister after cabinet minister after cabinet minister going out on television and saying something which is just patently nonsense. This was Dominic Raab doing just that on the BBC.
First of all, this was a workplace. They had a drink after what had been a grueling day and weeks and period, and that was clear and consistent with the rules. I don't think it's right, if I may say, to conflate, first of all, what would happen in a clinical setting. Clearly, a different set of rules applied, or indeed the wider rules on social mixing. This wasn't a social occasion. It was staff having a drink after a busy set of work meetings and the pressures of the day.
So it wasn't a social occasion. It was staff having a drink after meetings. Now, staff having a drink after work, that's a social occasion. It might be with your colleagues, but this is a social occasion. There's a reason you don't tend to be paid to go for drinks with your colleagues. It's because it's not work. You go to work with your colleague. That's when you're sitting at the desk, you're making your policy or whatever they do in number 10. Afterwards, when you go out for wine and cheese, that's a social gathering. Might be with your workmates. It's not work. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating. It also means that it is going to be very, very difficult for the government to make any kind of policy whatsoever, I think, where there are legal limits on who people can hang out with. Because as I say, you've got lots of people who might have been locked down for 10 days with COVID-19. They've been triple jabbed. They're going to hang out with 4 other friends in a house. And suddenly they're breaking the law. And you're saying, well, in the height of the first lockdown before vaccines, you had people in the government having these Christmas parties, having these quizzes, having these lovely garden parties, even though it was all against the rules. Now, suddenly, I'm supposed to respect the rules that say I can't chill in a living room with 4 friends. We are all always at some risk of getting COVID, especially at this point, catching it and transmitting it, even if not for serious disease. But the point still stands that there'll be people doing stuff that is a lot less risky than what they were doing then. And we're being told that's illegal. So that's why this is politically very, very difficult. And the goodwill that would be required to have some kind of serious lockdown or serious restrictions, I think, is evaporating. As I say, I should be clear at the beginning of the show. If it needs to be done, it needs to be done. If the hospitals are going to collapse, we have to take severe measures. But this is a terrible situation for us to find ourselves in. And it has a lot to do with the incompetence of this government. It's not just the natural functioning of the virus that's made this all inevitable.